Welcome to a new video lesson. In today's lesson, I will analyze chapter 4, 5, 6 and 7 of Pride and Prejudice. So, let's begin. Chapter 4 begins with Jane and Elizabeth being alone in their home. When they are alone, Jane and Elizabeth discuss the ball that has happened, and they discuss also about Mr. Bingley. They both find Mr. Bingley handsome and very well mannered, but Jane is not very discriminating in her judgment of character. She never sees any fault in anybody and therefore considers even the proud, conceited Bingley sisters as charming. So, what we find here is that the difference of character is presented through the dialogue delivery, the outlook, the views that one holds. Whereas Elizabeth, on the other hand, is able to see through the Bingley sisters' conceits. The chapter ends with a comparison of Bingley and Darcy. Though of contrasting temperaments, Bingley is easygoing, open and agreeable, while Darcy is clever but haughty, reserved and fastidious. They are very good friends, that is, Bingley and Darcy are very good friends. Bingley thinks that he had never met with pleasanter people or prettier girls than at the Meryton ball, while Darcy sees them as a collection of people in whom there is little beauty and no fashion. Darcy acknowledges Jane's beauty, but thinks she smiles too much. Even Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, that is, the elder sister of Bingley, are ready to concede that Jane is beautiful. Okay, so this chapter is primarily engaged in developing two sets of contrasts. Number one, Elizabeth and Jane, and the second one is Mr. Bingley and Darcy. The first contrast is achieved largely through dialogue. Jane is a pleasant, rather naive young girl who thinks that the whole world is as decent and simple as she is. Her intelligence has no depth, as she reveals in her enumeration of Bingley's virtues, and I quote, "He is sensible, good-humoured, lively, and so on, has manners, so much ease with such perfect good breeding." Elizabeth adds sarcastically that he is also handsome. Elizabeth is revealed to be realistic, intelligent and frank to the point of bad manners. She possesses a unique perceptive ability to see into the nature of all people when she herself is not intimately involved with them. Okay, so what we find here is that sweetness and gentility are the essence of her character, that is, of Jane's character. It is these aspects that strike the readers from the very first appearance. She is the most beautiful of all the girls of the Bennets, and indeed of all the girls in Meryton. Jane does not possess the liveliness of the mind and spirit that is characteristics of Elizabeth, but she is not the less interesting on that account. She is as sensible as her younger sister, and her looks and smiles radiate the essential simplicity of her character. It is not surprising, therefore, that Mr. Bingley should single out from his first acquaintance with her. Okay, so Jane's capacity for right judgment is shown in her choice of Bingley as a lover, for he is of the same temperament as Jane is, mild, lovable, and refined. Just as he yields to Mr. Darcy's superior judgment, Jane too is often found to lean on her spirited sister, though it is true that she is not as pliable as Bingley. She is not only virtuous but is incapable of imagining evil in others. That is, Jane cannot see anything evil in others. Being innocent herself, she cannot understand duplicity and meanness in others. These are vices which are non-existent in her dictionary. Elizabeth is clear-sighted in this aspect and is able to understand the defects of others almost at first sight. Jane is blind until the very end, and even when her eyes are opened to the existence of the defects of others, she admits the fact very reluctantly. And the same unwillingness to see evil in others is revealed in Jane's attitude to Wickham and Darcy, which will come in the later chapters. I am informing you from before. When her sister tells her about the account given by Wickham about Darcy, Jane is disposed to defend Darcy. She wonders whether anyone could be so wicked as to ill-treat a favourite of his father in that manner. So if we like to conclude or to say that it must be said from a soft nature that she is, it must not be concluded in this context that she is of a colorless personality because of her softness. It is true that she does not make an impression in comparison to her strong sister, but Jane is too capable of heroism in her own silent way. As if it can be said that think no evil, speak no evil, act no evil is the basis on which her character is formed, and no reader can be untouched by the tender little flower. Okay. The second set of contrasts that this chapter presents is not a result of dialogue but of Jane Austen's overt discussion of the two young men, Darcy and Bingley. Bingley is revealed to be like Jane. His quick renting of Netherfield shows a similar easy impressionability. Darcy is superior in intelligence. He is like Elizabeth in his frankness and clear-sightedness. Bingley has enjoyed himself and had never met with pleasanter people or prettier girls in his life, to quote. But Darcy had seen a collection of people in whom there is little beauty and no fashion. So, what we see here is that there is a contrasting picture that is being presented over here, and this contrasting picture is the basic projection of the ascendancy towards the climax. Okay, so this basic ascendancy, this complicating of the situation is presented through this contrast. So let's move on to chapter 5. In chapter 5, Mrs. Bennet and her daughters visit their neighbors, the Lucases. The Lucas family is described over here. The Lucas family lives at Lucas Lodge, a short walk from Longbourn. Sir William Lucas has once been a tradesman and had been knighted while he was a mayor. By nature, he is offensive, friendly, obliging, and courteous. Lady Lucas is a very good woman, though not clever. Of her several children, Charlotte Lucas is the eldest one. She is sensible, intelligent young woman of 27. So this age is at that time is quite high age, the mature age to get married, but she is not yet married. Okay, she is the oldest of the siblings and is Elizabeth's close friend. The ladies discuss the ball and much talk is about Jane's triumph, that is, her 2 dances with Mr. Bingley. The conversation then shifts to the cold and haughty Darcy. Charlotte makes a relevant point that she says that Darcy has a right to be proud because of his family's fortune, wealth, and his good looks. Elizabeth, who has been piqued by Darcy's insulting remarks, says, and I quote, "I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine." Okay. Mary then launches on the pompous but trite and distinction between pride and vanity, and so on. So what we see here is that this chapter is devoted mainly to discussion of Darcy's character in terms of his pride, and though it is revelation of prejudice against him is made. It is to Jane's advantage that she has observed that Darcy does not know many people in this part of the country, but among his acquaintances he is remarkably easy and pleasant. This is observed by Jane. Charlotte also feels that a man who has as much to offer as Darcy has a right to be somewhat proud. To this even Elizabeth gives assent. Thus, pride in a person is seen as justifiable if it is well grounded and does not transgress the limits. The lecture on pride given by Mary is nonsensical collection of platitudes that have no bearing on his personality. Chapter 6 describes that the ladies of Longbourn and Netherfield begin to exchange frequent visits. Jane becomes a favorite with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. Elizabeth and Charlotte often discuss the probability of Jane's marriage with Bingley. Elizabeth is happy that Jane makes no great display of affection, but Charlotte feels that to be so very guarded could prove disadvantageous. Okay, so that is what happens later when Darcy thinks that Jane is not interested in Bingley. To quote Charlotte Lucas says that, and I quote, "If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she will lose the opportunity of fixing him, and it will then be but a poor consolation to believe the world equally in the dark." Unquote. Charlotte believes that a woman ought to take the initiative and so feels that Jane should make the most of every moment she spends with Bingley. Elizabeth, however, disagrees on this part. In the meanwhile, to the reader's surprise, Darcy is getting more and more interested in Elizabeth. In spite of himself being saying that she is not tempting enough, she is not handsome enough to tempt him. Okay, though he had dismissed her as unattractive, he now finds her face, and I quote, rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes, unquote. He is attracted to her easy, playful manner and finds himself desiring her company. Elizabeth, however, is unaware of Darcy's growing interest in her and still thinks him to be a disagreeable fellow. Therefore, when at dinner party thrown by Sir William Lucas, Darcy offers to dance with her, Elizabeth refuses the offer. The chapter ends with conversation between Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy. Miss Bingley is not pleased to find Darcy contemplating Elizabeth's fine pair of eyes and chides him sarcastically by remarking that in choosing Elizabeth, he would also be letting himself for a mother-in-law like Mrs. Bennet. Okay, so what problem does Mrs. Bennet has? What kind of character she has? She is one of the most successful of the comic creations of Jane Austen. Okay, as she remarks in her appearance in the beginning, she is a matron, fairly advanced in age, with 5 daughters to care for. Her one passion in life is to see all her daughters married. With Mrs. Bennet, it has become an obsession. She believes that she has a good reason for her desire, for there is an entail on the property, and Mrs. Bennet is afraid that she and her daughters would be turned out mercilessly after the death of her husband. Not a day passes without her referring to the entail. Entail refers that if Mr. Bennet dies without the daughters being married, the daughters won't get any property. Okay, even after the marriage, they won't get any property. The property will be transferred to Collins. Okay, whatever. It is not surprising, therefore, that her imagination and heart run riot the moment she hears that Netherfield Park is to be occupied by a gentleman with £5,000 a year. She does not stop to analyze whether her own motives are unselfish. She is incapable of such thoughts, since she has developed a passion for husband hunting for her daughters. The readers might be tempted to pardon her efforts on behalf of her daughters, since the getting of husbands was considered to be the peculiar function of the parents in those days. But the objection against Mrs. Bennet is that she does not know how to do it in the proper manner. She makes herself ridiculous and actually defeats her own purpose by the clumsy and obvious maneuvers. She cuts a poor figure in the course of the ball at Netherfield. She talks about the expected marriage between Jane and Bingley aloud in the presence of Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth is heartily ashamed of her mother and requests her to lower her tone, but this merely worsens the situation. Mrs. Bennet remarks offensively so as to be heard by Mr. Darcy, and she cares nothing for him. It is not a surprise, therefore, that the guest at Netherfield takes the earliest opportunity to leave the place. Okay. This chapter contains an important universal truth expressed by Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte tells Elizabeth that human relationships do not grow in isolation. In order to make it perfect, it is necessary that it should be encouraged. Man is temperamentally full of vanity. He wants that his sense of self-importance should be boosted up and he should be flattered, though it is still questionable. Love must meet a healthy response from the other side. It is true. If a person loves another person, it is obligatory for one to encourage the other. It is very seldom found that love grows even without encouragement. Very true. Okay. It reveals that Charlotte herself wants to marry for practicality, convenience and position. In this chapter, several other views are also expressed about marriage. So, the theme of marriage is running all around. Lydia wants to find sexual pleasure. Jane and Elizabeth both want to marry for love and position. Ultimately, each character does marry according to their or to her view of this relationship. Another ball is presented in this chapter. The gap between Elizabeth and Darcy begins to shrink, largely for the latter's for Darcy's, that is, initiative. His original prejudice against Elizabeth starts dissolving, whilst hers remains intact. That is, Elizabeth's prejudice against Darcy remains intact, probably because of his refusal to dance with her at the first ball. She refuses to dance with him, and there begins a series of conversations in which they misunderstand each other. Jane Austen deals with the complex relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy in this beautiful manner. In chapter 7, Mr. Bennet's property, it begins with the description of Mr. Bennet's property and the estate, which earns him 2,000 a year, which unfortunately for his daughters passes to a distant relation on his death, that I said just now, because he has no male heir. Mrs. Bennet's father had left her £4,000, which was not a great deal to leave to her daughters. The Bennet girls go several times a week to the village of Longbourn, a mile from Meryton. Mrs. Bennet's sister, Mrs. Phillips, resides in Longbourn, and Lydia and Catherine particularly frequent in their visits, as they are interested in certain members of a militia regiment stationed in the neighborhood. Mrs. Phillips provides her nieces with enough knowledge of the names and connections of the officers. Mr. Bennet is annoyed by the continual chatter about the officers and observed that they are two of the silliest girls in the country. Mrs. Bennet defends them. Meanwhile, a note arrives from Jane, from Miss Bingley, asking her to dinner, as she and her sister are alone. Mrs. Bennet sends Jane on a horseback because it seems likely to rain, and then she must stay all night. Okay, so this is her plan. Things happen as anticipated by Mrs. Bennet, and the following morning a note arrives for Elizabeth from Jane saying She has a sore throat and a headache, and the Bingleys insist on her staying on. Elizabeth is anxious about Jane. Walks the 3 miles to Netherfield, much to the surprise of Mrs. Hertz and Miss Bingley. Tired and muddy as she is after the walk, Elizabeth is sure that they hold her in contempt for it. Mr. Bingley, however, receives her with kindness and good humour. The apothecary, that is the doctor, who has been summoned, diagnoses a severe feverish cold and advises her to stay in bed. Elizabeth is invited to stay with her sister. A servant is sent to Longbourn to inform her parents and to bring back a supply of clothes. So, in this chapter, we find that Mrs. Bennet's trick and Mrs. Bennet's husband hunting technique for her daughters is at work, and she is rightly at her purpose for doing so because of the property, because of the entail in the property. The readers can clearly see that how important it is to get the 5 daughters married, because Mr. Bennet's property is entailed so that at his death it must go to a male cousin. Consequently, this makes it even more imperative that each of the girls be well settled before Mr. Bennet's death. With such economic insecurity looming around, it is not difficult to realize the preoccupation of Mrs. Bennet with the problem of finding husbands for her daughters, or to appreciate the moral courage shown by Elizabeth when she returns down seemingly attractive marriage proposals offering economic security. The contrast between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet is further revealed. Mrs. Bennet's approval of her daughter's flirtations with the officers shows how shallow her values are, especially damning in her admission that she can still be excited by a uniform. Mr. Bennet may disapprove of the flirtations, but he seems helpless or too confused to provide the strong authority that is needed. Elizabeth says sarcastically, and I quote, "If Jane should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley." Unquote. The two of the youngest daughters of the Bennets are Lydia and Kitty, and their character can be analysed together. Since Kitty is merely a pale shadow of the other and has no marked individuality of her own, as is the characteristics of Jane Austen, she gives the readers an idea of their character from the very beginning. Okay, so her father, who is a shrewd judge of persons, remarks of her and Kitty, that is of Lydia and Kitty, that they are two of the silliest girls in the country. He hits the truth accurately in this remark that all the words and actions of Lydia bear it out. She is a born flirt and appears to have become an expert in the art by the time she is 16. She can be characterized. She has the characteristics of many silly girls of the period. She is strongly attracted by the officers that have their camp at Meryton, There is not a word that she speaks that is not concerned with the officers. It is not that she is attached to any officer in particular. She is more in love with the idea of being in love with persons in uniform. Accordingly, her talk is full of them, and she is actively encouraged by her foolish mother in this respect. Mrs. Bennet indeed provides a defense for her daughter by referring to her own feelings for the officers when she was young with such indulgence on her part, and nothing more than sarcastic remarks on the part of her father. Lydia grows to be a confirmed coquette. None but Elizabeth realizes the danger that might befall such an unsteady character, and not only Lydia but the entire family reaps the fruit of the folly of the girl. Okay, so as the chapter closes, however, Elizabeth has apparently disgraced herself in Darcy's eyes by walking to Netherfield Park in mud. He seems to be embarrassed by her condition after the walk. Once again, however, appearances are deceiving. Okay, although it is clear that Bingley's sisters are amused, Darcy sees something noble in Elizabeth's self-sacrifice. Also, we can see Mary's pedantic nature is once again revealed when Elizabeth decides to go immediately to Netherfield Park on hearing Jane's illness. Mary launches into her usual speech and says that a person should not run blindly after his impulse. And the remark that Mr. Bennet made about Kitty and Lydia, that they are two of the silliest girls in the country, applies to Mary too, with this difference that she is a learned fool. The only qualification that the other two have, Mary does not possess, namely a tolerable personality. Probably because she cannot exercise this weapon in the armory of women. Mary directs her attention towards the fine arts. She fancies that she is a great scholar and player on the piano. It is true that she does not spare herself in her attempts to gain proficiency in her chosen field, but fortune has been no kinder to her in endowing her with taste and intellect than beauty of form. The result is she turns out to be a shallow woman who has conceited idea of her abilities. The hours she does not spend at the family table, she devotes to studying books in her room or learning music, but her attainments are of the poorest order. And she is the laughing stock of her father, whose sole enjoyment lies in making fun of others. She does not give the impression of a live character, but the dull embodiment of a particular weakness. Her portraiture is one of the many caricatures of a similar type in the novel. So let's end it here. We will continue this with the next chapters in the next lesson, next class. Okay, thank you.